At 6:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the USS Texas shuddered as a German shell slammed into her starboard side. The impact echoed through the battleship's steel corridors like a bell struck by a giant's fist. Inside, Damage Control Central, Chief Boatswain's mate Raymond Hoback felt the deck plates jump beneath his boots. He knew that sound. Steel meeting steel at supersonic velocity, the kind of impact that could crack a hull plate or worse, breach the fire rooms below the waterline. Above the deck, the Texas's 14-inch guns had been firing for over an hour, hurling one-ton shells toward the German fortifications on Pointe du Hoc. The air reeked of cordite and burnt oil. Smoke rolled across the water in thick curtains, turning the morning sky over Normandy into a grey haze that swallowed the horizon. The battleship was positioned less than 3,000 yards from shore, deliberately close, so her guns could support the Army Rangers struggling to climb the cliffs. That proximity made her a target. The Germans knew it. They'd been waiting. The first shell struck at the waterline, tearing through the hull just forward of turret number 3. Hoback didn't wait for the damage report. He grabbed his tool bag and ran toward the breach, his crew following behind him through narrow passageways that smelled of steam and fear. When they reached the compartment, seawater was already pouring through a jagged hole the size of a dinner plate. The pressure was immense. Each second, gallons of ocean forced their way into the ship's belly, flooding the spaces where men slept and worked. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hoback pressed his hand against the cold steel, feeling the vibration of the sea, trying to claim the ship. He could see daylight through the wound, a pale shaft cutting through the darkness. The compartment was already ankle-deep, the water rising steadily. He shouted over his shoulder to his men, "Get me the collision mat and timber wedges. Move!" Around him, the Texas continued to fire. Each broadside from the main battery shook the entire vessel, a rhythmic thunder that made concentration nearly impossible. The gun crews above had no idea what was happening below their feet. They only knew their mission: to silence the German artillery before it tore apart the landing craft carrying thousands of soldiers toward Omaha Beach. But inside the hull, another battle was unfolding, a battle against the sea itself. The second shell hit moments later, this time near the bow. The sound traveled through the ship like a scream. Hoback heard it over the roar of rushing water and knew immediately they had multiple breaches. 2 holes meant 2 teams, 2 races against time. He grabbed his radio handset and called to Damage Control Central. "We've got flooding in compartment A407. Need another crew forward now." The response came back clipped and urgent, already dispatched. 3rd hit reported aft, starboard side. 3 breaches. Hoback's mind raced through the calculations. Each hole represented tons of water per minute. The Texas displaced over 27,000 tons, but even a battleship had limits. If they couldn't seal the compartments quickly, the flooding would spread, pulling the ship down by the bow, or worse, capsizing her as the weight shifted to one side. He'd seen it happen before at Pearl Harbor, where battleships had rolled over in minutes, trapping men inside as the water rose above their heads. But the Texas wasn't at anchor in a calm harbor. She was under fire, her guns blazing, maneuvering constantly to avoid the next shell. The crew below decks worked in near darkness, the emergency lighting casting long shadows across the flooded compartments. Hoback's team moved with practiced efficiency, hauling the heavy collision mat through the passageway. The mat was a thick canvas tarpaulin, reinforced with rope and weighted at the edges. In theory, it could be dragged over an external breach and secured, the suction of the incoming water pulling it tight against the hull. In practice, it required perfect timing, brute strength, and a willingness to work waist-deep in freezing seawater while the ship shook from enemy fire. Hoback and 3 of his men wrestled the mat into position. The water was rising faster now, swirling around their knees. He could feel the cold seeping through his uniform, numbing his legs. One of the younger sailors, a kid from Iowa named Patterson, looked at him with wide eyes. "Chief, this is bad, isn't it?" Hoback grabbed the edge of the mat and pulled it toward the breach. "Only if we don't fix it. Now help me get this over the hole." They worked together, fighting the current, dragging the canvas across the opening. The suction was tremendous. As soon as the mat covered the breach, the water pressure slammed it against the hull with a wet slap. Hoback hammered wooden wedges into the edges, sealing it as tightly as possible. The flow slowed, but didn't stop. Water still seeped around the perimeter, trickling down the bulkhead. It would hold for now, but it wouldn't last forever. Above them, the fourth shell struck. This one hit the superstructure, tearing through the radar mast and sending shrapnel raining down onto the deck. Men scattered, diving behind gun mounts and ammunition lockers. The ship's executive officer, Commander Robert Brody, stood on the bridge with Captain Charles Baker, watching the shoreline through binoculars. He lowered them slowly and turned to the captain. "Sir, we've taken 4 direct hits. Damage control reports multiple flooding below the waterline." Baker didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Can we maintain position?" Brody checked the status board. "For now, but if we take many more, we'll have to withdraw." Baker looked back at the beach, where landing craft was circling through the smoke, waiting for the signal to head toward shore. Withdrawing meant leaving those men without fire support. It meant watching the Rangers on the cliffs get cut down by German machine guns. It meant failure. He shook his head. "We hold position. Tell damage control to keep her afloat." Below decks, Hoback didn't need to be told. He was already moving toward the next breach, his boots sloshing through water that was now mid-calf deep. His team followed, exhausted but determined. They had trained for this. Every sailor on the Texas had spent hours learning how to fight fires, seal compartments, and control flooding. The Navy called it damage control, but it was really something simpler. It was survival. When they reached the second breach, Hoback found another team already working. A burly machinist's mate named Sullivan was hammering a wooden plug into a smaller hole, his face streaming with sweat despite the cold water. The plug held for a moment, then blew out under the pressure, spraying seawater across the compartment. Sullivan cursed and grabbed another plug. "This one's too damn big, Chief." Hoback knelt beside him, examining the breach. It was irregular, torn rather than punched clean. That made it harder to seal. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out a length of oakum, tarred rope used for caulking. "Stuff this around the edges, then drive the plug in hard. Use the heavy mallet." Sullivan nodded and got to work. Hoback stood back, watching the water level. It had stopped rising in this compartment, but he could hear the pumps struggling to keep up. The bilge pumps were designed to handle minor leaks, not combat damage. If the flooding continued, they'd be overwhelmed. The fifth shell hit just after 7 a.m. This one struck the port side near the engine room. The concussion knocked men off their feet. In the boiler room, firemen scrambled to maintain steam pressure as the ship rocked violently. One of the feed pumps shuddered and went offline, its bearings damaged by the shock. The chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Franklin Pierce, grabbed the intercom. "Bridge engineering, we've lost number 2 feed pump. Steam pressure is dropping." Captain Baker's voice came back calm but firm. "Can you maintain speed?" Pierce glanced at the gauges. "For now, but we need to reduce power to the port shaft if we lose another pump." "Understood. Do what you can." Pierce hung up the intercom and turned to his men. "Bypass the damaged pump and reroute through number 3, and somebody find me a patch kit for that steam line before it cracks." Back in the flooded compartment, Hoback received word of the 5th hit over his radio. He wiped seawater from his face and looked at his team. They were soaked, exhausted, and running out of materials. The collision mats were deployed. The timber wedges were mostly used up. If another shell breached the hull, they'd have to improvise. That's all right, Hoback thought. Improvisation was what damage control was all about. The 6th shell arrived at 7:03 a.m. It struck the aft superstructure, damaging the secondary battery director and starting a small fire, but this time the crew was ready. Fire parties rushed forward with hoses, dousing the flames before they could spread. The damage control teams below decks continued their work, sealing compartments, shoring up bulkheads, and pumping water overboard. 18 minutes had passed since the first shell struck. 18 minutes of chaos, flooding, and desperate improvisation. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the German artillery fell silent. The spotters on Pointe du Hoc had been destroyed by the Texas's guns. The threat was over, at least for now. On the bridge, Captain Baker lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. "Damage report," he said. Commander Brody consulted the status board. 6 hits, sir. 4 breaches sealed, flooding contained, no casualties. The ship is still combat effective." Baker nodded. "Then we continue the mission." Below decks, Raymond Hoback sat on the deck of the flooded compartment, his back against the cold steel bulkhead. His hands were bleeding from the rough timber and oakum. His uniform was soaked through, but the water had stopped rising. The collision mats were holding. The Texas was still afloat, still fighting. He looked at his men, who were slumped against the walls, too tired to speak. One of them, Patterson, caught his eye and gave a weary grin. "We did it, Chief." Hoback nodded slowly. "Yeah, kid. We did." But he knew the truth. They hadn't just sealed a few holes in a ship. They had fought the sea itself and won. They had kept a 40,000-ton battleship alive under fire, using nothing but canvas, timber, and sheer stubborn will. And somewhere above them, on the beaches of Normandy, thousands of men were landing under the protective fire of the Texas's guns, never knowing how close they'd come to losing that support. Understanding what made this moment possible requires stepping back from the chaos of D-Day and examining the ship that made it happen. The USS Texas was not just any battleship. She was a survivor, a relic of an earlier war, brought back to fight in a conflict that had outgrown her. Commissioned in 1914, she was the last dreadnought battleship still in service by the Second World War. Her design came from an era when naval warfare meant slugging it out at close range, steel against steel, with victory going to whichever ship could absorb more punishment. By 1944, the world had changed. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the dominant force at sea. But the Texas still had a role to play. Her 14-inch guns could hurl shells weighing nearly 1,500 pounds over 23 miles with devastating accuracy. That made her perfect for shore bombardment, where her firepower could support troops landing on hostile beaches. But firepower alone wasn't enough. What made the Texas truly formidable was her crew's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. The battleship's hull was divided into hundreds of watertight compartments, each sealed by heavy steel doors that could be closed in seconds. This design, inherited from the dreadnought era, was intended to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the ship. If one compartment was breached, the others remained dry. In theory, the Texas could survive multiple torpedo hits or shell impacts without sinking. In practice, that theory was about to be tested in the waters off Normandy. The ship's damage control organization was equally sophisticated. Every sailor on board received training in firefighting, flood control, and emergency repairs. The damage control parties were organized into teams, each responsible for a specific section of the ship. They drilled constantly, practicing scenarios where the ship was hit by torpedoes, bombs, or shells. The Navy knew that in combat, speed mattered. A breach that wasn't sealed in minutes could sink a ship in half an hour. The tools of damage control were deceptively simple: collision mats, timber wedges, oakum, and quick-setting cement. Nothing high-tech, just basic materials used with skill and determination. The collision mat, in particular, was a marvel of practical engineering. When dragged over a breach from the outside, the suction of the incoming water pulled it tight against the hull, creating a temporary seal. It wouldn't stop the flooding entirely, but it would slow it enough for the pumps to catch up. Wooden wedges and shoring beams could reinforce bulkheads that were buckling under pressure. Oakum, the tarred rope used by shipbuilders for centuries, could be stuffed into cracks to slow leaks, and if all else failed, sailors could simply close the watertight doors and abandon a flooded compartment, sacrificing that section of the ship to save the rest. But every decision came with a cost. Closing a door might save the ship, but it could also trap men on the wrong side, condemning them to drown as the water rose. The crew of the Texas had learned these lessons the hard way. During the North African campaign in 1942, the battleship had been hit by a near-miss bomb that buckled her hull plates and caused minor flooding. The damage control teams had sealed the breach, but it took over an hour, and the ship had to withdraw from the battle. The experience taught them that speed was everything. When the Texas arrived off Normandy in June 1944, her crew was ready. The mission for D-Day was clear. The Texas would provide fire support for the assault on Omaha Beach, targeting German fortifications that threatened the landing force. But the most dangerous target was Pointe du Hoc, a cliff-top position where German artillery could rake the entire beach with fire. The Rangers, assaulting that position, were counting on the Texas to silence those guns. Before they climbed the cliffs, Captain Baker had positioned his ship deliberately close to shore, well within range of German counter-battery fire. It was a calculated risk, one that assumed the Texas could absorb punishment and keep fighting. That assumption was about to be tested. The German artillery battery at Pointe du Hoc consisted of 6 captured French guns, each capable of firing a shell weighing over 200 pounds. The battery commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, had positioned his guns in reinforced concrete casemates that were nearly invisible from the sea. He had also trained his crews to fire on moving targets, a skill that would prove critical in the coming battle. When the Texas opened fire at dawn, Weber's spotters quickly identified her position and began calculating firing solutions. The first German shell was a ranging shot, falling short of the Texas by several hundred yards. The second landed closer, sending up a towering plume of water off the starboard bow. Captain Baker ordered evasive maneuvers, but the Texas was not a nimble ship. She was a 30-year-old dreadnought, designed for straight-line slugging matches, not for dodging artillery fire. Her turning radius was over 800 yards, and at her current speed of 12 knots, it took nearly a minute to change course significantly. The third German shell found its mark. It struck the Texas at the waterline, tearing through the hull with a sound like thunder rolling through the ship's steel bones. In Damage Control Central, the status board lit up with red indicators showing flooding in compartment A407. Chief Hoback grabbed his gear and ran, his team following close behind. They had drilled for this moment 100 times, but no drill could replicate the reality of combat. The ship was firing, maneuvering, and shaking from the recoil of her own guns. The passageways were filled with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives. When Hoback reached the flooded compartment, he found chaos. Water was pouring through the breach with tremendous force, spraying across the room like a fire hose. The compartment was already knee-deep and the level was rising visibly. 2 sailors were trying to wrestle the collision mat into position, but the current was too strong. Hoback waded into the water, feeling the cold shock as it soaked through his uniform. He grabbed one edge of the mat and shouted to his men, "On 3, we pull it over the hole. Don't let go no matter what. 1, 2, 3. They hauled the heavy canvas across the breach, fighting the suction. For a moment it seemed the water would tear the mat from their hands. Then, with a sudden slap, the mat sealed against the hull. The pressure of the incoming water pulled it tight, and the flow slowed to a trickle around the edges. Hoback grabbed wooden wedges and a mallet, hammering them into place to secure the seal. His hands were already bleeding from the rough timber, but he didn't stop. Every second counted. The second breach was harder. The shell had torn an irregular hole in the hull, leaving jagged edges that prevented a clean seal. Hoback knew they couldn't use a collision mat on this one. Instead, he ordered his team to bring timber shoring and quick-setting cement. They built a wooden frame around the breach, then packed the gaps with oakum and cement. It was crude, improvised, and entirely against regulation. But it worked. The water flow slowed, then stopped. The compartment was still flooded, but the pumps could handle the remaining water. By the time the 6th shell hit, Hoback and his teams had sealed 4 breaches and contained the flooding in 2 more compartments. They had worked for 18 minutes straight, waist-deep in freezing seawater, with the ship shaking from enemy fire and the roar of her own guns. 18 minutes that felt like hours. When the German artillery finally fell silent, destroyed by the Texas's counter-battery fire, Hoback allowed himself a moment to breathe. He leaned against the bulkhead, his chest heaving, and looked at his men. They were exhausted, soaked and bleeding, but they were alive. The ship was alive. What made those 18 minutes possible was not luck or heroism alone. It was preparation, training, and a culture of damage control that had been drilled into every sailor on the Texas. The Navy had learned hard lessons from Pearl Harbor, where ships had sunk because damage control parties couldn't reach flooded compartments or didn't have the right equipment. In the years since, damage control had become a religion. Every sailor, from the captain to the lowest seaman, was trained in flood control and firefighting. The damage control parties practiced constantly, running drills in simulated combat conditions. The equipment they used was simple but effective. Collision mats had been standard on Navy ships since the First World War, but by 1944 they had been improved with stronger canvas and better securing mechanisms. Timber shoring kits included pre-cut beams and wedges designed to fit standard bulkhead dimensions. Quick-setting cement could seal small leaks in minutes, hardening underwater to create a waterproof plug. And the watertight doors, the unsung heroes of damage control, could be closed in seconds to isolate flooded compartments. But the most important element was the human factor. The men of the Texas's damage control parties were not specialists brought in for emergencies. They were ordinary sailors, cooks, gunners, and machinists who had been trained to fight fires and control floods alongside their regular duties. They knew every compartment, every valve, every pump on the ship. When disaster struck, they didn't need detailed orders. They knew what to do and did it. Chief Hoback exemplified this culture. A career Navy man who had enlisted in 1932, he had served on the Texas for 3 years and knew her intimately. He could navigate her passageways blindfolded, and he knew which bulkheads were strongest, which pumps were most reliable, and which compartments could be sacrificed if necessary. That knowledge, combined with years of training, made him the right man in the right place at the right moment. But Hoback would never claim credit for what happened that day. To him, it was just the job. You train, you drill, you do what needs doing, he would later say. That's all there is to it. The German perspective on that morning's battle tells a different story, one of frustration and disbelief. Hauptmann Weber watched through his binoculars as his shells struck the Texas repeatedly. 6 direct hits, any one of which should have forced the battleship to withdraw. But the Texas kept firing, her guns never falling silent. Weber later wrote in his report that he believed the American ship must have been damaged, but was somehow remaining in action through sheer determination. He was not entirely wrong. The German gunners at Pointe du Hoc were skilled artillerymen, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. They knew how to calculate firing solutions, adjust for wind and range, and hit moving targets. But they had never faced a ship like the Texas, a vessel designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The battleship's thick armor belt, her compartmentalized hull, and her trained damage control parties gave her a resilience that the Germans had not anticipated. When the Rangers finally overran the battery position later that morning, they found the gun crews still at their posts, stunned that they had failed to stop the Texas. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the Texas continuing her mission without interruption. While the damage control parties pumped water from the flooded compartments and made temporary repairs, the gun crews kept firing. The ship's main battery continued to target German positions along the coast, supporting the troops struggling to advance inland from Omaha Beach. Captain Baker refused to withdraw, even though his ship had taken significant damage. He knew that every minute the Texas remained on station was another minute of fire support for the men ashore. In the flooded compartments below decks, the cleanup began. The damage control parties used portable pumps to remove thousands of gallons of seawater, working in shifts as the ship rocked gently in the swells. Chief Hoback inspected each breach, checking the integrity of the temporary seals. The collision mats were holding, but he knew they wouldn't last forever. As soon as the Texas could withdraw, she would need proper repairs in a shipyard. For now, though, the improvised patches would have to do. The physical toll on the crew was significant. Men who had spent 18 minutes working in freezing water were now dealing with exhaustion and mild hypothermia. The ship's medical officers set up aid stations to treat cuts, bruises, and exposure, but morale remained high. The crew knew they had been tested and had passed. They had kept their ship alive under fire, and that knowledge gave them a quiet pride that no medal could equal. By mid-afternoon on June 6th, the situation on Omaha Beach had stabilized. The Rangers had captured Pointe du Hoc, silencing the German artillery that had threatened the landing force. The troops ashore were pushing inland, supported by naval gunfire from the Texas and other ships of the bombardment force. Captain Baker finally gave the order to withdraw to deeper water for damage assessment. As the Texas steamed away from the coast, her crew could see the beaches behind them, crowded with landing craft and vehicles. The invasion was succeeding, in part because the Texas had held her position when it mattered most. The formal damage assessment came that evening. Naval architects and engineering officers inspected the 6 hits, measuring the size of the breaches and evaluating the structural integrity of the hull. Their report was sobering. The Texas had taken 6 direct hits from heavy artillery, 4 of which had penetrated below the waterline. The temporary repairs had prevented catastrophic flooding, but the ship needed extensive work before she could return to combat. The collision mats and timber shoring would need to be replaced with welded steel plates. Several bulkheads had been weakened and required reinforcement. The repair work would take weeks, possibly months, but the architects also noted something remarkable. Despite taking 6 hits in rapid succession, the Texas had suffered no casualties. Not a single sailor had been killed or seriously wounded by the German shells. The damage control parties had sealed the breaches so quickly that flooding never spread beyond the initial compartments. The ship's watertight integrity had held, preventing the kind of progressive flooding that had sunk so many vessels at Pearl Harbor. In their official report, the architects concluded that the Texas's survival demonstrated the effectiveness of proper damage control training and equipment. Captain Baker received a commendation for keeping his ship in action despite significant damage, but he deflected the praise, pointing instead to the damage control parties who had fought the sea while he fought the Germans. In his after-action report, Baker wrote, "The crew's performance under fire was exemplary. The damage control parties sealed multiple breaches in 18 minutes, preventing catastrophic flooding and allowing the ship to continue her mission. Their training and professionalism saved the USS Texas and enabled her to provide critical fire support during the Normandy landings." Chief Raymond Hoback received a Navy and Marine Corps medal for his actions that day, though he considered the recognition unnecessary. To him, the real reward was knowing that his ship and his men had survived. Years later, when asked about D-Day, Hoback would say, simply, "We did our job. That's what we trained for. The ship took hits, we fixed them, and we kept fighting. That's what damage control's all about." The story of the Texas's survival spread quickly through the fleet. Other ships' crews heard about the 6 hits and the 18-minute response, and it became a benchmark for damage control effectiveness. Training programs were updated to emphasize speed and improvisation, 2 qualities that had been critical to the Texas's survival. The Navy's Bureau of Ships studied the damage reports and photographs, using them to improve damage control procedures on other vessels. The lessons learned on D-Day would save lives throughout the rest of the war. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The Texas proved that even heavy damage did not mean defeat. A ship could be hit repeatedly, flooded, and still remain combat effective if her crew was properly trained and equipped. This understanding changed how naval commanders thought about risk. They became more willing to position ships close to shore, knowing that damage control could keep them fighting even under heavy fire. The Texas herself would go on to participate in several more amphibious assaults, including the invasions of southern France and Okinawa, always positioned close to shore, always absorbing damage, and always keeping her guns firing. The technical aspects of what the Texas accomplished that day deserve closer examination. When a shell penetrates a ship's hull below the waterline, it creates an immediate crisis. Water begins pouring into the ship at a rate determined by the size of the hole and the depth below the surface. A breach 1 foot below the waterline might admit a few hundred gallons per minute. A breach 10 feet below could admit thousands. The Texas's breaches were all between 5 and 15 feet below the waterline, meaning the flooding was severe and immediate. The first challenge for any damage control party is simply reaching the breach. Watertight doors must be opened and closed behind them to prevent flooding from spreading. Equipment must be carried through narrow passageways, often in darkness or emergency lighting. Once at the breach, the team must assess the damage and decide on a response. Is the hole small enough to plug with timber and cement? Can a collision mat be rigged? Should the compartment be abandoned and sealed off? These decisions must be made in seconds, with water rising around your legs and the ship shaking from enemy fire. The collision mat technique used by Hoback's team was particularly effective but dangerous. The mat had to be dragged over the breach from inside the compartment, fighting against the current of incoming water. If the suction was too strong, the mat could be torn from the sailor's hands and sucked against the hull in the wrong position, making the situation worse. Once in place, the mat had to be secured with wooden wedges hammered into the seams around the breach. This required someone to work directly at the point of maximum water flow, often submerged to the waist or chest. It was exhausting, terrifying work, but when done correctly, it could reduce a catastrophic flood to a manageable leak in minutes. The timber shoring technique used on the irregular breaches was equally impressive. Wooden beams were cut to length and wedged between the bulkhead and the hull, creating a framework that could support tons of water pressure. Oakum was stuffed into the gaps, then quick-setting cement was applied to create a waterproof seal. The cement hardened underwater in less than 5 minutes, creating a plug strong enough to withstand the pressure. It was not a permanent fix, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to last long enough to get the ship to safety. The pumping capacity of the Texas was another critical factor. The battleship was equipped with multiple bilge pumps, capable of removing thousands of gallons per minute from the lower compartments. As long as the pumps could keep pace with the incoming water, the ship would not sink. But if the flooding exceeded the pumping capacity, the water level would rise relentlessly until the ship capsized or sank. That's why speed mattered so much. Every minute the damage control parties could shave off their response time was another minute the pumps had to catch up with the flooding. The watertight integrity of the ship's compartments was the final piece of the puzzle. The Texas was divided into hundreds of watertight spaces, each sealed by heavy steel doors with rubber gaskets. When these doors were closed, they created barriers that water could not pass. This meant that flooding could be contained to specific areas, preventing it from spreading throughout the ship, but it also meant that anyone trapped on the wrong side of a closed, watertight door would likely drown as the water rose. It was a grim calculus that every damage control officer understood. Sacrifice a few compartments to save the ship. On D-Day, the Texas's damage control parties made all the right decisions. They sealed the breaches quickly, used the appropriate techniques for each type of damage, and maintained watertight integrity throughout the ship. The result was that despite taking 6 direct hits below the waterline, the Texas never came close to sinking. The flooding was contained, the pumps caught up, and the ship remained combat effective. It was a textbook example of a damage control done right, and it set a standard that would be studied for decades to come. The German artillery crews who scored those 6 hits could not have known what they were facing. From their position on Pointe du Hoc, they could see the splashes of their shells striking the Texas, but they could not see the damage control parties working below decks. They could not see Chief Hoback and his men wrestling collision mats over breaches, or the pumps straining to remove thousands of gallons of seawater, or the watertight doors slamming shut to contain the flooding. All they could see was a battleship that refused to sink, refused to withdraw, and continued firing with undiminished fury. In his post-battle report, Hauptmann Weber expressed frustration and grudging respect. The American battleship absorbed 6 direct hits and remained in action, he wrote. Either our shells were defective, or which I doubt, or their damage control is far superior to anything we have encountered. I believe the latter is true. Weber's assessment was accurate. The Texas's damage control was indeed superior, not because of any secret technology or brilliant innovation, but because of relentless training, adequate equipment, and a crew that knew their ship intimately. The legacy of that 18-minute battle extends far beyond the immediate survival of the Texas. The story became a case study in naval damage control, taught at the Naval Academy and in damage control schools around the world. It demonstrated that proper preparation could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It showed that ordinary sailors, given the right training and equipment, could perform extraordinary feats under pressure. and it proved that even in an age of aircraft carriers and guided missiles, the old virtues of seamanship still mattered. Chief Raymond Hoback remained in the Navy until 1946, retiring as a chief warrant officer. He never spoke much about D-Day, preferring to let the official reports tell the story. But those who served with him remembered a quiet, competent man who knew his ship better than anyone and who never panicked even when the water was rising and the shells were falling. After the war, Hoback returned to his home in Virginia and worked as a marine surveyor, inspecting ships for damage and recommending repairs. He died in 1973, largely forgotten by history, but remembered with respect by those who had served alongside him. The USS Texas survived the war and was decommissioned in 1948. She was preserved as a museum ship in Houston, Texas, where she remains today, the last surviving dreadnought battleship in the world. Visitors can walk her decks and tour her compartments, though few realize that the ship beneath their feet once took 6 direct hits in 18 minutes and survived through the skill and courage of her crew. The breaches have long since been repaired, the flooded compartments pumped dry, but the story remains, etched into the steel and memory of a ship that refused to sink. When you stand on the deck of the Texas today, looking out at the calm waters of the Houston Ship Channel, it's hard to imagine what it was like on that morning in June 1944. The roar of the guns, the concussion of enemy shells, the desperate race against time in the flooded compartments below. But if you descend into the lower decks, into the narrow passageways where the damage control parties fought their battle, you can almost hear the echoes of that day. The sound of rushing water, the shouts of sailors hauling equipment, the hammering of wooden wedges into place, and above it all, the steady voice of Chief Hoback directing his men, keeping them calm, keeping them focused, keeping them alive. The story of the USS Texas and her damage control parties is not just about one ship or one battle. It's about the power of preparation, the importance of training, and the difference that competent leadership can make in a crisis. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions. And it's a reminder that heroism often looks less like charging into battle and more like standing waist-deep in freezing water, fighting to save your ship while shells are falling around you. If you've ever wondered what separates ships that survive from ships that sink, the answer is simple: training, equipment, and people who refuse to give up. The Texas had all three, and that made all the difference. 6 hits, 18 minutes, 0 casualties. It was not a miracle. It was seamanship at its finest, damage control executed to perfection, and proof that even in the chaos of war, preparation and skill can triumph over disaster. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.